Bradley. Mr. Bradley.
Grumile mai agat Cloncoile agus go begas lat as an jeis lorha an cuj Jerry den Villashaw. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute on the final stage of this bill. Mr. Speaker, the focus of the debate around this bill has moved over the last number of months. It has moved away from the issue of a special advisor or special advisors losing their jobs as a result of its provisions, and it has moved to how we deal with victims and the past. And, Mr. Speaker, the SDLP has always adopted a rights-based approach to issues here, and our record clearly shows that. Included in that approach are the rights of victims and a victims-based approach. I myself have brought victims' issues to this House. Time and time again, Mr. Speaker, you will recall I have brought motions to the floor of the Assembly in support of the families of the disappeared and their right to give a Christian burial to the remains of their loved ones. I have spoken here in support of the families of the King's Mills massacre and also in support of the families of the victims of the Glenanne gang. I have stood with the family of Paul Quinn in the hospital when he died, at his graveside, and on numerous occasions, including on the floor of this House. I have supported victims of Republican, Loyalist and state violence, as well as victims of collusion, because, Mr. Speaker, I believe that is the right thing to do. And, Mr. Speaker, that is what the SDLP does and has always done, and that's what I am doing here today. I believe that the SDLP is the only party in this House which can lay that claim and has the record to prove it. We have no vested interest in hiding the truth of the state's violent actions, whatever agency carried them out. And we have no vested interest in hiding the truth of Loyalist violent actions, including their and Republican collusive actions with state agencies. And we have no vested interests in hiding the truth of Republican paramilitary violence, including that of the IRA. But, Mr. Speaker, there are vested and personal interests in state and terror groups which have little appetite for a comprehensive process of truth. There are people who had command and control of organisations, both state and non-state, who directed, conducted or approved of appalling terror and violence, and for whom a comprehensive process of truth and accountability is removed from their thinking. Our efforts, Mr. Speaker, to amend the Special Advisers Bill were solely aimed at creating a better piece of legislation, not at protecting any vested interests. And, Mr. Speaker, you will recall much reference has been made to the Good Friday Agreement and the rights of ex-prisoners therein, and I respect those rights. But that agreement also seeks to acknowledge and address the suffering of victims of violence, and we must stand by that. The bill may affect a tiny number of an elite of ex-prisoners, but it will have significance for a huge number of victims from all backgrounds, Mr. Speaker. And it would be helpful if Mr. Allister would make it clear that he recognises that there is a range of victims: victims of Loyalist paramilitaries, victims of Republican paramilitaries, victims of state violence and victims of state collusion with paramilitaries, both Loyalist and Republican. There has been much talk about this bill leading to the sacking of one Sinn Féin special advisor. But there is a certain irony in the fact that the only Sinn Féin special advisers who have been sacked to date have been sacked not by the Minister's regulations, not by the Special Advisers Bill, but by Sinn Féin themselves. And, Mr. Speaker, I will not be mentioning all of those sacked by name, but I will refer to one of them, Mary McArdle. She was sacked by Sinn Féin from her post as a Special Advisor. Now, Sinn Féin might dress that decision up in some fancier dress or clothes to hide the fact, but it is nonetheless a fact, Mr. Speaker. She was not afforded an appeal mechanism of any type. Her employment and human rights were cast aside in the interest of Sinn Féin's political expediency. And, Mr. Speaker, we'll have to ask, what message does that send out to ex-prisoners? What is Sinn Féin saying to former prisoners? You can have a job with us, but if it is politically expedient for us, we will unceremoniously boot you out of your post. And I am sure that ex-prisoners are not reassured by that message, wherever they may work, but particularly if they work for Sinn Féin. And what does that message send out to other employers or potential employers of ex-prisoners? What about the ripple effect of that decision? Sinn Féin had done Mr. Allister's work for him before he had even a chance to draft this bill. Is it all right for Sinn Féin to summarily dismiss ex-prisoners when it is politically expedient for them? And, Mr. Speaker, ex-prisoners should be aware that Sinn Féin has set a dangerous precedent. They believe that you can be summarily dismissed from your post if you prove to be a barrier to Sinn Féin's progress. There will be no court, no civil service commissioners to hear your appeal. You will just have to pack up and go. And, of course, one has to ask the question, why Sinn Féin sacked Mary McArdle? And the answer, Mr. Speaker, to that question is very clear. Sinn Féin recognised that her appointment had inflamed the sensitivities not only of the family of the victims of her crime, and not only of victims everywhere, but of the public in general. So Sinn Féin attempted to assuage the ire of the public by sacking Mary McArdle. And in doing so, Mr. Speaker, they conceded the fact that there is an issue around appointing perpetrators to such positions. In sacking Mary McArdle, they have also conceded that there is indeed some basis to this bill which is before us today. This was a major faux pas by Sinn Féin, which they haven't even yet awakened to. All of Mr Mackay's filibustering was in vain when they have already conceded that important point. And, Mr Speaker, my colleague Conall McDavid has said that all we have to date to address the past is a patchwork quilt of mechanisms, none of which can bring the comprehensive and ethical approach which the SDLP has always advocated. This bill is yet another pattern in the patchwork. It is not the long-term answer which all victims deserve. The past, Mr Speaker, is present around us here, from Kingsmill to Ballymurphy, from the Newry Customs bombing to Bloody Sunday, from Claudy to Glenanne, and across many other cases. And, Mr Speaker, families, victims and survivors are speaking out in their search for truth and accountability. These voices, as we have heard recently, are resilient, articulate, fearless, and with a wisdom that the pain of loss and the passage of time brings. The SDLP believes that the increasing strength of the voices of families, victims and survivors is a call to all that this phase of politics must comprehensively address the past, that this is a central issue around which politics should revolve. We must clarify the terms of the debate on victims and the past. Clarity will not suit everyone. It will not suit some vested interests. The SDLP position is that we must deal with these issues on an ethical basis, which means basic fairness and equality of treatment. That means that all victims, and Mr. Speaker, there is a legal definition of victims which we insist on, that all victims should get the same fair and equal treatment. There are even some people who are both victims and perpetrators. We treat them all equally as victims, but not as perpetrators. So, Mr. Speaker, that is the basis on which we approach this bill. We think that it is flawed, but in a situation where victims are being so sadly neglected for political reasons, the lesser evil in this case is to abstain. And I believe that is an honourable position, and indeed it is an ethical position. I would like to think that this House could go further than the debate on this bill to deliver an equal, ethical plan for dealing with our past. And for the sake of victims and for the sake of the future, I hope that we do that. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mike Nesbitt.